What you see on the screen is a sped-up tool-assisted speedrun of Elden Ring that finishes the game in under 3 minutes. While it may seem highly confusing at this point, I promise you that by the end of this video, you will understand every single thing performed. You might have already heard of the zipping glitch, but trust me, you've never seen it executed with such precision and speed. I will also provide you with the most detailed, up-to-date explanation of it yet. This task was created by the player ViRazY in the 80% unrestricted category. Let's begin by explaining what that even means. Any percent aims to simply finish the game by reaching its credits as quickly as possible, without any other requirements, as opposed to more completionist categories like all remembrances or all achievements. In Elden Ring, unrestricted allows 2 massive game-breaking glitches: the zipping glitch and the force quit wrongboard. These are banned in other categories because they either depend on hardware or exploit a gray area of completely shutting down the game during the speedrun. But since this task's goal is to finish the game as quickly as possible, any percent unrestricted was the obvious choice. Now, what exactly is a TAS? It's not like the typical real-time speedrun seen on the leaderboards or live streams. A tool-assisted speedrun is a carefully crafted creation that's made using specific tools to achieve theoretically perfect gameplay, usually impossible for humans. But it is still created by a human. Most tool-assisted runs use emulators which provide features like save states, frame-by-frame advancement, and memory watch, making tasking way more convenient. Yet, modern PC games don't have access to such tools, so the speedrun had to be done differently. Instead of save states, the runners saved and quit out of the game into the main menu at specific points of the run to create multiple segments. For each of these segments, he set up perfectly planned macros of inputs and simulated mouse movements until the next quit out. It would be preferable to avoid the segmentation, but even with it, putting this run together took considerable effort and many retries. That's because modern games suffer from tiny fluctuations in performance. Physics engines in old games were often tied to the frame rate, making it easy to create consistent inputs. But current titles have decoupled the different systems, which run at their own speed. Elden Ring's frame rate is so inconsistent that the scripted inputs start drifting after just a few seconds of playback. Finally, a task is by no means intended to compete with real-time speedrunners. It rather serves as a demonstration of the game's potential. With technicalities out of the way, let's look at what it really takes to reach the credits in Elden Ring. The stone platform at the end of the game can only be accessed once Elden Beast is slain. To get to Elden Beast, we must burn the air tree and cover the capital Leyndell in ash. This involves defeating Maliketh, located in Farum Azula, which is reached only from the Giant's Forge at the end of the mountaintops of the Giants. Those are entered through an elevator, which can be activated only after killing Morgoth in Leyndell's regular version. But at the start of the game, the capital is sealed off until at least 2 shardbearers are defeated and the roundtable hold is entered at minimum once. Technically, 5 different shardbearers can be reached from the beginning: Godric, Renala, Radahn, Rykard, and through Varys' offline questline, even Mog. Choosing which bosses to pursue will depend on the specific routing. Well, except for Mog, as that takes forever. This is only a snippet of the game's content, but it still amounts to numerous things to do, especially when it's supposed to be done in under 3 minutes. So how is it possible? Well, it's not. In reality, the game's code enforces only 2 major requirements. There is no way to reach the credits without killing Elden Beast, and Ashen Capital is its own unique map, so spawning the final boss in the regular version is impossible. This means that Maliketh is also required to reach this map, but if there was a way to get to Farum Azula early, all of the previous requirements could be obsolete, since the teleport from Farum Azula to the Ashen Capital happens automatically when Maliketh dies. In fact, an isolated part of Farum Azula is even accessible early on through a preview area at the 4 belfries. The game's just asking for trouble at this point. So, with that in mind, the first goal of the speedrun is to reach the belfries in Liurnia. Before the run begins, ViRazY selects the Vagabond class because it wields a medium shield. Classes like Confessor or Hero also have medium shields, but neither carries enough equipment to be put into the heavy load equipment tier from the get-go. As we will see in a second, the heavy load and the shield are essential requirements. The timer starts as soon as we gain control of the Tarnished. And what just happened? This is the first instance of the zip glitch, one of the 2 game-breaking glitches used in the run. You may note that it is performed by blocking and then briefly moving forwards about 2 seconds later, but there's a lot more to it than that. In this case, the Tarnished blocks, moves, stops moving, moves again, and suddenly teleports to the top of the Chapel of Anticipation instead of picking up the finger and exiting normally. So why does this occur? The working theory is that overlapping the slow walk animation with the idle blocking animation can pass on specific values to a new block loop, which corrupts velocity calculations and results in extreme momentum applied to the character for exactly 1 frame. This makes it look like the player just teleports around. You can just hold block forever. so the animation has to loop itself at some point. Of course, this is also true for the regular idle animation, but when starting to walk, the idle animation is completely replaced. Meanwhile, the blocking idle animation continues to play in the background while walking. Because of this, timing the slow walk at the end of the first loop corrupts the next loop and makes the tarnish zip. Interestingly, even at such a high speed, the collision system can still detect the tarnished hitting objects and make them bounce around. That's why when the TAS zips into a wooden chair, it gets bounced off to the upper floor of the chapel. Now, not every idle blocking animation is the same, and that's why it was important to start with the medium shield. Zipping is a bit quicker with a medium shield in the left hand and a one-handed weapon in the right hand, compared to two-handing a weapon. Small shields or any other combination will be slower as well. Between these two, the animation sequence with the medium shield is a couple of frames shorter than with a two-handed weapon, so activating a zip is slightly faster. All of the frame values are calculated at 60 frames per second. To explain the timing of the inputs, let me bring up this graph. One sequence of the medium shield zip is 133 frames long. That is 133 frames from the moment we start blocking. The goal is to input a slow walk at the end of the idle block loop, but it is not so simple. The slow walk must be between 4 and 10 frames long. Otherwise, the overlap won't happen and the zip won't work. This interval of 4 to 10 frames is called the primary move time, while the waiting period beforehand is the primary wait time. The wait and the move time together must add up to 133 frames. In practice, this means the tarnish starts holding block and waits, then presses down a direction to slow walk for 4 to 10 frames, depending on how long the primary wait time was. Once they let go of the direction, they keep blocking, and exactly 17 frames later, the zip is executed. So although the direction can be held for 4 to 10 frames, the exact timing always depends on the primary wait time, making the zip an exceptionally precise, frame-perfect trick. Yet looking closely, ViRazY starts to block, but instead of just idling, he moves, stops moving, then moves again. So what is happening? What I have described so far is the so-called one-step zip method, which uses only one directional input, so it's made of the primary wait time and the primary move time. But there's also the two-step zip method. Its advantage is that it speeds up the animation loop, allowing the task to execute a zip about a second faster. The downside is that it also reduces the velocity and thus the distance covered by the zip, so it cannot be used everywhere. In practice, it is done by starting to hold block, but instead of beginning with the primary wait time, we start with a primary move time of exactly 57 frames. This is followed by a brief primary wait time and a subsequent secondary move time of anywhere between 4 to 10 frames. This means that the primary wait time can vary again, but the entire sequence must add up to 79 frames, down from the 133 frames of the one-step method. Humans never use two-step zips, as they introduce another point of precision to the process through the additional move time. For a TAS, however, well, it's just not a problem. Now, this move time at the end of the loop, whether it's a one-step or a two-step zip, lasts between 4 and 10 frames, but the length doesn't just determine the preceding wait time. It also changes the generated velocity, so it can be used to manipulate the distance the zip covers. Its function is represented by a kind of parabola. I mean, sort of, right? Move times of 7, 8, and 10 frames cover roughly the same distance, while 5 or 6 frames generate a lower value. Oddly enough, the move time of 9 frames stands out and covers the most distance of all. The second reason for starting Vagabond comes into play here as well. Heavy loaded characters zip further by about 8%. For illustration, here is also the difference between one-step and two-step zips. The two-step method covers roughly 11.5 to 12.5% less distance. In the first zip, the TAS uses the 57-frame primary move time of the two-step zip to reposition to a precise location and ensure a proper bounce. It then waits for 15 frames and moves again for 7 frames to activate the zip, which executes exactly 17 frames later, springing the tarnished upwards. Right after that, there's a quick jump when moving forwards because on flat ground, but especially when moving uphill, jumping is faster than sprinting, to a certain point. Basically, the first half of the jump animation is faster than sprinting, while the second half of falling is slower. The falling part lasts longer when going downhill, so running there is quicker. On flat ground, repeated jumps are barely faster, but after introducing an incline, the slower fall is interrupted by landing on the ground early, so that mostly only the quicker part remains. But at a slope of 30 degrees or more, the faster part of the jump will be interrupted as well, making sprinting faster again. Also, just spamming jumps results in a fatigued mini-jump. This is prevented by briefly blocking between the hops, which allows proper jumps to be executed back to back. While running to the balcony, the menu flashes briefly. That is not an error, but since there is no menu delay, the TAS can navigate the menu at lightning speeds. It unequips the halberd, putting the Tarnished from heavy load to medium load, and thus slightly reducing the distance of the following extremely strict zip. The TAS then quits out for the first time to create another segment of the run. As mentioned, these would be best avoided, but they lose less time than it may seem. That's because Elden Ring runners use the in-game timer to time their speedruns, which does not run during loading screens or within the main menu. Some PCs will benefit from quicker load times, so cutting them out ensures the fairest possible competition. The TAS also adopts this timing method. To get to the 4 belfries, the TAS performs another 2-step zip with readjustments, but surprisingly doesn't land in Liurnia. Why not? It's because loading Liurnia is impossible unless the character is standing on the ground close enough to it, so zipping from the chapel directly to the belfries is impossible. Instead, the TAS zips to Stormwell Castle relatively nearby. More precisely, it zips to this outer tower and lands on the inside, as it's just a version of Stormwell used for background details, not the actual castle. Before we move on, you may be wondering, the player just fell from the sky. How is it possible that they survived? The explanation is relatively simple. The game calculates fall damage based on the y-coordinate of the initial position, from which it subtracts the y-coordinate of the landing position. As we zip from a place globally lower on the map, the landing y-coordinate is greater than the initial one. The subtraction results in negative numbers, and the game effectively thinks that the Tarnished moved upwards instead of falling. So it does not apply any fall damage, even though the character moved up and down during the zip. During the fall, the TAS re-equips the halberd and places the Memory of Grace item on the hotbar for quicker use. This comes into play right after ViRazY drops down to a lower floor, which the game considers close enough to Liurnia and decides to load the region. He then immediately uses the item, which should take him back to his last site of grace, or in this case, the Chapel of Anticipation. But instead, he ends up spawning at the beginning of Liurnia. So what happens? This is the first of 2 uses of the 4-squid wrong warp glitch found in most modern FromSoftware games. When traveling to the chapel by using the Memory of Grace, the game needs to update the player's position in coordinates. However, the game has a 4-frame buffer for the stored position. It takes 5 frames after loading in before the stored position from the old area, Liurnia, is replaced by a stored position in the chapel. This process can be interrupted by force-quitting the game with the Alt F4 shortcut during a certain part of the loading screen, which causes a disconnect between the new area and the stored position variable. Upon reloading the save file, the game uses the stored position from the original area to determine where to place the player, but loses track of which coordinates to use exactly. It then runs a failsafe procedure that puts the player to the first spawn point on that area's list. You see, the game's world is divided into many different regions, and these regions all have multiple spawn points. Some of them are used when the player teleports to a site of grace, some for Stake of Marika checkpoints, and some for multiplayer related purposes, but all are part of one internal list for that region. The first point on this list is used during the wrong warp, but not all such points are safe. Some are located out of bounds and cause the player to fall to their death. Yet for the region the TAS just entered, the used spawn point is at the beginning of Liurnia, behind Stormwell Castle, which is highly convenient because the following zip can be performed from there. There are several things to unpack here. First, a 1-step zip is performed backwards into the wall after the wrong warp. This makes the Tarnished bounce and land all the way at the Raya Lucaria Academy. The precision behind this zip is insane. You can see the TAS reposition itself ever so slightly after loading back in, making it possible to reach the desired destination. The rock is on this side of the academy, basically right next to the 4 belfries, at least in a zipping context. A 2-step zip with repositioning is performed, while the rock serves as a ramp to give the Tarnished the needed height. height. They zip perfectly above the chest containing the imbued stone key required to activate the teleporters here. Landing in this exact spot allows the Tarnished to open the chest while standing on top of it, which makes them fall to the front and cancels out the opening animation, so the item can be picked up quicker. Immediately after, a small two-step zip skips the short running section. We cannot zip directly to the Fire Missoula portal because it is too low. It would result in a death from fall damage. While dropping down, the Tarnished times an attack just before hitting the ground, aiming it at the wall. Slashing it makes the weapon bounce off, cancelling the landing and saving time over the regular animation. The zip and fall cancel are repeated, and the picked up key is used to open the portal leading to Farm Azula's preview area. There, a second force crit wrong warp conveniently transports the player to the regular farm, as it turns out that the starting location is the first spawn point on the internal list of the entire dungeon. ViRazY first jumps over the railing to get a clear path to the next area. He then two-step zips towards the balcony, but in doing so activates a so-called death cam trigger. A death cam is a plane the game uses to trigger a vertical camera view in cases where the player falls to their death. In most instances, a separate kill plane will reduce the health bar to 0 and be positioned slightly below the death cam, but that was avoided. The TAS quits out after landing to get rid of the death cam since continuing with the top-down view is not feasible. Besides, when the death cam is active, the game stops loading or deloading all assets. You may have seen this abused in other FromSoftware games to bypass certain areas. After 2 jumps, another quit out starts the next segment since it will be a long one, including several pixel-perfect zips. The goal is to get to and defeat Maliketh, but we only have our longsword, so what do we do? Okay, a lot has happened in this section. Let's start at the beginning. To kill Maliketh, ViRazY needs to ensure that the game loads him in properly. His first phase is not preloaded until the player is close enough to the arena, so the first zip is a clever one step into this pillar, which bounces off the character to the right on top of Maliketh's arena. As soon as the roof is stepped on, the boss is loaded. Now, the TAS just zips into the middle of nowhere and the boss dies. How? Well, if the Tarnished roams away very far, I'm talking several minutes of running on torrent far from an area, the game will deload that area regardless of where the player is. But the entities within that area will not unload, meaning they will all fall under the map. And if anything in Elden Ring falls for more than 12 seconds, it dies even without hitting a kill plane. So that's the theory. But there are 2 problems. First, the player will also be killed after falling for 12 seconds. And second, a regular zip has no chance of taking ViRazY far enough. Step aside, zips, and enter mega zips. What the heck is a mega zip? Think of them as zip extensions. You may recall me saying that during a regular zip, 1 or 2 step, once they let go of the direction, they keep blocking, and exactly 17 frames later, the zip is executed. During this brief waiting period, after the setup is finished, but before the zip is executed, the player can input another movement, which greatly boosts the generated velocity. The key must be pressed for exactly 2 or 3 frames, and is called the extension move time. It has to occur anywhere from 1 frame after the original setup is finished to before the zip itself happens. This seems pretty lenient, but hold on a second. The wait time between the initial setup and the extension move time, which we call extension wait time, will drastically influence the extra obtained distance. This graph illustrates the difference. As you can see, the longer the TAS waits before inputting the extension move, the greater the distance becomes. Now, to give you a sense of scale, these are the velocities generated by regular zips, without an extension, and this is a mega zip. The difference can be more than sixfold. So that's how ViRazY solves the second problem of zipping far enough. In the TAS's case, it is impossible to see the inputs for the megazips, as ViRazY uses an extension wait time of 13 frames. Hence, the extension move happens literally frames before the megazip executes. However, if you watch a human perform it, you can observe the primary move for the regular zip, then a short extension wait, and then a very short tap serving as the extension move. Back to our first problem. If the Tarnished fell for 12 seconds alongside Maliketh and they both died, it would only eliminate the first phase of the boss fight, which is not good enough. The solution cannot be seen in the TAS, but can be heard. Listen. ViRazY performs an R1 attack while falling, which resets his fall timer back to 12 seconds and allows him to outlast Maliketh in the fall. This trick is why the TAS uses the 1.04 version of the game, as patch 1.05 fixed this fall timer extension. Meanwhile, the earlier versions are avoided due to less stable performance. The Beast Clergyman and Maliketh are entirely separate entities, so even though the fall timer completely depletes the boss's health bar, it doesn't end the fight. Instead, a cutscene follows that conveniently returns the player back to specific coordinates within the arena, allowing the Tarnished to avoid death. But now there's another issue. Since the player didn't enter the fight regularly, the boss AI was never activated, and the second phase does not spawn. The AI script is triggered by traversing the fog wall, so the Tarnished needs to exit the arena. Of course, leaving through the fog is not possible. This is not the Fool's Idol. Luckily, the TAS can perform a cool bounce zip that flings it to just outside the fog. After re-entering, the game needs a moment to figure out what to do, creating a perfect opening for the next mega zip. ViRazY does a precise setup using one of the pillars as a platform to bounce out of the arena far, far away. Those with a keen eye might have noticed that the player dies during the second fall. This is because in addition to the 12-second kill timer, the game uses a global Y coordinate as another failsafe that would kill the player. The first mega zip generated a lot of height, since the roof of Mali's arena served as a ramp. In contrast, this zip doesn't generate much, so the player character will reach the killer Y coordinate. Yet the R1 attack can again slightly delay the impending death, although we don't really know how. What we do know is that it delays it enough so that Maliketh dies just as the player is about to be teleported back to their last grace, meaning they get transported to the Ashen capital instead. To activate the final boss, the Tarnished needs to get close enough to its arena, just like with Maliketh. A quick two-step zip does the trick and lands them on this roof before the arena. Now, Elden Beast is only fought after Radagon is defeated, but the game keeps its model and the arena loaded at the same time, far below the stone platform, to keep it ready for when Radagon dies. A cutscene then plays, and the player is teleported to the arena under the map. This of course means that the TAS can perform the last mega zip of the run and deload everything. This is the most complicated setup yet, a two-step mega zip, where the primary move lasts 57 frames, followed by a primary wait time of 13 frames and the secondary move time of 9 frames. The extension wait is 13 frames, and the TAS finally taps W for 2 frames, resulting in a very distant mega zip. Once again, ViRazY attacks in the air to cheat his own death while waiting for Elden Beast to die. But this is not Elden Beast. Godfrey's first phase actually ends up dying first, which teleports the Tarnished back to the arena and reloads everything. Yet, Elden Beast is still under the map, falling. So the TAS simply has to stall by running away from Horaloo. It then times the save and quit perfectly with Elden Beast's death, speeding up the move to the stone platform. You can't see the boss die, but you sure can hear it. After touching the statue and skipping 2 cutscenes, ViRazY's TAS finishes Elden Ring, the game of the year 2022, in 2 minutes, 42 seconds, and 180 milliseconds. The level of precision displayed in this tool-assisted speedrun is incredible. It beats the human world record by 1 minute and 15 seconds, and could be even better if proper TAS tools were created. ViRazY would surely be up to the challenge. If you want to watch the uninterrupted run, I'll left a link below the like button. All in all, it is amazing that FromSoftware's biggest game in terms of scale ended up with the shortest completion. If you enjoyed this thorough breakdown, subscribe for more similar content and like the video to help me out. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.